Elizabeth's Navy, 70 years of the post-war Royal Navy with over 260 images. This highly illustrated history of the ships and operations of the Royal Navy during the reign of the late Queen Elizabeth II. The Royal Navy changed out of all recognition as from a superpower navy with worldwide bases. It's been eclipsed, but it remains a powerful force. Here to tell us more about it is Paul Brown. Paul, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles. Nice to speak to you.
Yeah, good to have you with us as well. So tell us a little, British naval power. Britannia rules the waves, etc. The Royal Navy as an extension of foreign, or as a vessel, if you pardon the pun, of foreign policy. That's the opening gambit, Paul.
Okay, yeah. Well, of course, things have changed dramatically since 1952, at the start of Elizabeth's reign. At that time, we had the second largest navy in the world. We'd been overhauled by the Yanks in the Second World War, but we still had a big navy. We had 326 major ships, warships. By that I mean ships of frigate or submarine size or above. And we operated worldwide. We had bases. We had a Mediterranean fleet, a home fleet, and we had squadrons in the Far East, the Middle East, the South Atlantic, and the Caribbean. And the Navy's role then, we still had an empire, of course, and we had a huge merchant fleet, the biggest merchant navy in the world. And the Navy's role, in part, was policing that vast network of trade routes around the world. And that's why it had that worldwide presence. But also, of course, by 1952, the Cold War had set in. We date that probably to 1948. So the Navy had another role as well as its kind of traditional trade protection role, and that was being aware of and being able to counter the threat from the Soviet Navy. And that's what kept the Navy, if not big, at least a reasonable size throughout the Cold War. We had the biggest shipbuilding industry in the world, and so on. So we were a powerful maritime nation. And since Victorian days, we've been sending a gunboat anywhere where there was a bit of trouble to maintain that empire. But the empire was beginning to crumble. And even worse, Britain's economic base was crumbling after the huge debts that we'd incurred in the Second World War. So there was a big question mark then over whether we could maintain our Navy and indeed our other armed forces at the kind of size they were at. As well as those ships I mentioned, 328, we had 400 smaller vessels. We had over 150,000 men in the Navy. And we spent something like 11% of our gross domestic product on defense. So now you can compare that with now when it's just over 2%. So everything has actually reduced, you could say, by a factor of about 5 in that 70 years. Except the number of ships, that's reduced by a factor of 10. So we've seen those massive changes. And of course, in that time, I've talked numbers, but also the shape of the Navy has changed dramatically. What we saw in about 1960, we had nuclear-powered submarines coming into service. We had guided missiles beginning to be fitted to all ships. So the whole technology was changing then. And in the mid 60s, we got Polaris, which was the nuclear ballistic missiles. And the Navy took over from the RAF the role of the nation's strategic deterrent. So instead of having hundreds of V-bombers in readiness to go and bomb Russian cities, we had 4 ballistic missile submarines, Polaris submarines. These had been brokered by Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister in the early 60s with President Kennedy, so that we got all the technology from the Americans, although the nuclear warheads were still British and the boats were British built, but the missile system was American. And so the idea of that was to always have one Polaris submarine at least on patrol at sea at any one time within striking distance of all those Russian and Soviet cities. That was a big new role for the Navy.
You see, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because that marks the change that the Navy's had to undergo. Because if you think about pre-Cold War, it was all about, okay, as you said, we're having a bit of trouble in this colony, so we'll send something impressive to lurk off the coast, and that'll keep the natives quiet. Or with brinkmanship, you could just send a gunboat up the Dardanelles. I mean, you couldn't, during the Great Game, for example, you couldn't move for Disraeli or Gladstone sending something steaming up towards Turkey. But with the Cold War, it becomes, and this is the first time there's been a Cold War, because previously to that, you sent your galleon up there and off you went. But it's a much more covert operation, and the rise of, as you said before, submarines, that could go off and be pretty much undetectable and be lurking. And it's not just the, I can see that frigate over there, because you obviously, by its very nature, submarine warfare, it's a bit more undercover stroke underwater. So you know that they're out there somewhere, but it's just that perceived threat during the mutually assured destruction years.
That's right. Yeah. So it was a big change because, okay, we know in World War II that the huge threat and problems that the big German U-boat force was to us. Well, the Russians took note of that. So immediately after the Second World War, they acquired some of the most modern German submarines, as did we. Now, throughout the Second World War, the Germans had been innovating like mad with their submarines. So their submarines by 1945 were nothing like the ones they had in 1939. So the Russians thought, well, this is the thing to do. And even by about 1950, they had 300 submarines either building or in service. Compare that, we probably had about 50. The submarine became, if you like, a capital ship, replacing a battleship as a major weapon. And the Cold War, a lot of it was fought inside the Arctic Circle. There was no direct conflict, but all the time, it was a cat and mouse game where our submarines were trailing their submarines, the Russian Soviet submarines, and trying to find out all about them through very dangerous espionage missions that they conducted, getting extremely close and underneath the Russian submarines and all sorts of things like that. And of course, the Russians were trying to do the same to us, although they weren't so good at it, actually. They were always a bit behind until perhaps about 1980. They'd actually caught up there with us by then. How did they catch up? Through spy rings. There were a number of spy rings, both in the UK and America, that divulged a lot of the new technology to the Soviets. So we had this underwater potential war all the time. And every so often it flared up, perhaps when two of the submarines collided. And the Navy would always say, oh, our submarine hit an iceberg. Well, it didn't. They never hit an iceberg. They hit another Russian submarine that they were trailing and trying to get all the information on. But they would never, and to this day, all those files remain secret. Even it all started in the early 50s. Even all the files dating to the early 50s are closed. So what we know has been leaked out by veterans, people who've left the Navy and spilled a bit of their story and so on, But there's an awful lot about the Cold War that we don't know. And of course, are we entering a new Cold War? That's the other thing. Because we've got all the implications of Ukraine and Russia. Since 2008, Russia has been building up its armed forces. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, they really declined because their economic base was in trouble. But in 2008, Putin decided to build up all the Russian forces again. And he said about that, and of course, that's been transformed in. But even bigger threat now is China. We think of Russia as being a threat, but China is now has more ships than the United States Navy. and its armed forces have been increased exponentially over the years. So what we see towards the end of this 70-year period that I talk about in my book is the Navy having abandoned east of Suez by Harold Wilson in the late 60s because it didn't have the money. Polaris had sucked a lot of money up, of course. So Wilson and the Labour government decided they'd have to scrap the aircraft carriers, pull back from east of Suez, and we'd basically become an East Atlantic Navy dealing with the Cold War. Pull out of all the other places around the world except the Middle East. We had to keep a presence in the Middle East because that's where the oil came from. So we had to keep an Royal Navy squadron there, and we still do, to maintain the oil routes in that area. Now, having pulled out all this time later, we're now trying to reestablish a presence in the Indo-Pacific region because of the threat from China. It's more of a token presence. But last year, one of our huge new aircraft carriers, Queen Elizabeth, led a task force out to the South China Sea for 7 months to show that we could still deploy a force in that region, albeit we needed the help of our allies because we're not big enough to mount these kind of operations on our own now.
It's interesting to say, isn't it? We say that, obviously we decided to become an East Atlantic naval power, if you like, or concentrate on that region. And yet in 1982, everybody was caught figuratively with their naval pants down, of course, and we were back into a good old-fashioned colonial war, basically.
Yeah, nobody really thought that would happen. I mean, this problem with Argentina claiming the Falklands had been simmering for, 100 years or more. But nobody thought it would blow up into a full-scale war. So it did take everybody by surprise. Now, the Navy had just been hit in 1981 by a big defense review, John Knott, who savaged the Navy. The size of the Navy was going to be halved. And the Navy thought, this is our big moment. So the head of the Navy said to Margaret Thatcher, we can send a task force down to the Falklands and we can reclaim those islands. The Navy can do that. RAF can't do it because we haven't got any bases anywhere remotely near the Falklands. They're 8,000 miles away. So we'll send our 2 aircraft carriers, which we still had, smaller ones than we'd had before. We'll send them down and we can recapture the islands, So it was the Navy's big moment. Now, it was a close-run thing because what we were up against was the Argentine Air Force. Now, they had 200 aircraft. 100 of them were strike aircraft that they could throw at our ships and our forces. We had 20 Sea Harriers on board the 2 aircraft carriers. So it was 100 versus 20. And, of course, they were near to all their bases in Argentina. So they could pop out whenever they liked and attack us, whereas we had all the huge logistical problems of maintaining this fleet 8,000 miles from home with Harrier aircraft that only had quite a short range. When they left the aircraft carriers to patrol over the Falklands, they only could do about a 20-minute patrol before they had to return to the ship. Most of the time was spent transiting between the aircraft carrier and the Falklands on what were called combat air patrols. So it was a huge strain on us and we suffered losses. We lost 6 ships through those aircraft. But we prevailed. We managed to land through amphibious landings in San Carlos water. We got the troops ashore, unopposed as it turned out, because we'd fooled the Argentines on where we were going to make the landings. So our troops landed, and of course the rest is history. But that up to that point couldn't have been achieved without this Royal Navy task force that had been sent down there. And even on the Falklands, a lot of the troops were Royal Marines, part of the Navy. And they crossed the Falklands, crossed East Falkland from San Carlos to Stanley, which is the capital of the Falklands. Now, they had to do it on foot because the ship carrying their helicopters had been sunk by an Exocet missile. That was the most feared weapon. It was a new word, Exocet. Nobody ever heard it before. It entered our language. I'd been hit by an Exocet. And one of the ships we lost, it was a lesser ship in some respects, vital because it had all the Chinook helicopters, the Wessex helicopters that were going to carry the troops across the islands. as a result, they had to trek across the islands. You're talking about big distances. Look at it on the map. Oh, they look like little islands. They're the size of Wales. Everything we compare to the size of Wales, don't we? Well, they were, so that it was no mean task to get across the Falklands. It was a huge endurance task for those paratroopers and Royal Marines, and then successfully take Stanley and lead to the Argentine surrender.
And because if you look at the way that the Navy traditionally fought battles, it hadn't really changed, shall we say, in the 300 years between the Armada and Trafalgar, that way of, coming in line and then letting loose. But obviously, during the 20th century, the way, the tactics and the strategy that the captains would employ had changed. And obviously the Navy changed with that as well.
Yeah, a lot changed. I mean, the enemy was now over the horizon. Back in Nelson's day, or the Armada, they were a few hundred yards away from you or even alongside you. Now they were over the horizon. You couldn't see those Exocet carrying jets until the last minute because they were sea skimming and the missiles were sea skimming, traveling at about 600 knots, 600 miles per hour, those missiles. So you didn't know about it really till it hit you, as they found out in HMS Sheffield. So things were much more remote in that respect. Things were a lot more technological. The trouble with the Falklands was all the technology was new. Computers were new, guided missiles were new, and so on. And so a lot of things failed. That made it even more difficult. The thing that we're seeing now is so-called autonomous unmanned systems. And that's the way it's all moving. We're getting unmanned submersibles. Instead of manned submarines, we're moving towards unmanned submersibles. Mine hunters now, instead of being ships that have to go and physically deal with the mines, they're now unmanned launches go out and deal with them. And of course, we've got drones. We know all about drones from the UK, from the Ukraine war. So we've got hypersonic missiles, laser guns, and all sorts of things now. That another really revolution, you could say, from that one that happened in the 60s and took us up more or less to the present day. We're now entering yet another era of this new technology.
And also the Navy may have changed sort of shape and image beyond recognition in those 70 years, but there's something that tugs in there on the heartstrings, the emotional heartstrings of the British people with the Navy. It has been their demonstration of power and influence on the globe. And I'm thinking back to in the 70s, Ark Royal, the TV series with the Rod Stewart song, which was a huge TV hit. And I'm probably, as it say, that was it. Yes, indeed. And it was probably one of the best recruiting tools for the Royal Navy they ever had.
Yeah, well, the Navy's still very aware of that. There have, of course, been several series of warship on TV recently with one or two nuclear submarines and also Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier. So, yeah, I hope it is close to people's hearts, if you like. We should still be a maritime nation. Our Navy is small, but it is actually potent. We've still got those nuclear-powered submarines. We've got the Trident submarines, having replaced Polaris. We've got these big new aircraft carriers. Trouble is, it's all spread a bit thin. We've got a wide capability, but not so much in depth. And that's where we need our allies. We have to work now with our NATO allies. We can't do many things on our own.
So with 260 images through the 70 years, you've got to have a personal favourite, Paul. What was the one that you put in there that you thought, yes, if I had to spend an afternoon or a week on board any of these, this is the one I'd go for?
Well, that's a tricky question. I suppose, they're all brilliant, but I tend still to hark back to the 1950s because I was around in the 50s, but you won't believe that, but I was. I was incredibly young. but I went down to the beach at Stokes Bay and I saw the 1953 Coronation Review. So I'd like to go back on board, let's say one of those cruisers like the Sheffield or the Belfast in the 1950s, because they were the last remnants of the kind of big gun navy, or the Vanguard herself, the last battleship. Those pictures, they're all there in the 1950s, evoking that fantastic era. So yeah, that's where I'd like to be.
Book is called Elizabeth's Navy, 70 Years of the Post-War Royal Navy. It's by Dr. Paul Brown, who we're speaking to today. Paul, if people want to find you, where can they get hold of you online?
Oh, well, they can track me on Facebook, if they can find me, I hope, or through the Osprey, my publisher's Osprey. They can find me through their site. Brilliant
military publishers are Osprey. And of course, the book will be available as a download from our own virtual bookstore. This book is called Elizabeth's...
Oh, good.
Indeed. This book is called Elizabeth's Navy, 70 Years of the Post-War Royal Navy. It's by Dr. Paul Brown. Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. I can only play out with one thing, and that is Rod Stewart, of course.
Well done.
I am sailing